country needs you. There's never been a more daunting time for us, maybe during the Civil War. But I mean, when you look at the challenges we face with this very aggressive revisionist Russian leader, with a rising China that is bent on changing the status quo by force if necessary, with threats from climate change to cyber attacks to proliferation, the list goes, pandemics. I mean, given the period of disruption, technological disruption that we're in, we need the tech sector. We can't do it without the best and brightest minds in tech.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Defense Tech Underground podcast. In today's episode, we interview Michèle Flournoy, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. I'm your host, Jeff Faniff, and my co-host is Helen Phillips.
In today's episode, we discuss Michèle's leadership in defense and national security policy and her experience working for prolific leaders throughout her tenure. Michèle shares her expertise regarding Xi's growing aggression toward Taiwan and measures for the DoD to take to deter China.
Michèle Flournoy is the co-founder and managing partner of WestExec Advisors, a strategic advisory firm. She is the former CEO and founder of the bipartisan think tank, the Center for a New American Security. Michèle served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from February 2009 to February 2012 in the Obama administration. She was the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and in National Security Council deliberations.
You are listening to the Defense Tech Underground, where we explore the intersection of technology and national security. The podcast is produced in partnership with the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University and with the generous sponsorship of Rhombus Power. We aim to support the national security innovation community. Now I bring you Michèle Flournoy.
Michèle Flournoy, thank you for joining us on the Defense Tech Underground.
It's good to be with you both. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, we are so grateful to have you join us on the podcast. To start off, can you talk about how you got into a career in government and defense policy?
Sure. Well, I sort of came of age at the height of the Cold War. I was in grad school when Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev were rattling their nuclear sabers at one another, and it seemed like nuclear war was actually a possibility, and so a pretty existential threat. And so I decided that I wanted to focus on initially nuclear arms control and reducing the nuclear danger, because it seemed like if we didn't deal with that problem, we wouldn't be around to deal with anything else.
Michèle, you've had a very storied career. Under President Obama, you were the highest-ranking woman in the history of the DoD. Can you explain your role as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy?
So the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, it's the number 3 position, civilian in the Department of Defense, and you're really the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense on all policy issues, but also oversight of civilian oversight of military planning, and also civilian oversight of military operations. So you represent the Secretary at the Deputies Committee level in the NSC process. You help the Secretary with all of his or her international engagements, and you represent the department, abroad, in the media, on the Hill, et cetera. So it's the sort of primary policy voice in the Defense Department.
Michèle, across your career, you've had the opportunity to work with President Obama and Secretary Gates, as well as Secretary Panetta. Can you talk about the type of leadership they demonstrated in their tenure?
It's a great question, and I really had a privilege to work for all 3 and learned a lot about leadership watching them. I think from, President Obama, one of the things that was extraordinary is his ability to create an environment, a sort of command climate, if you will, that ensured that people felt comfortable raising dissent or different points of view, even if it meant ostensibly disagreeing with him. And he created this climate where he not only tolerated dissent, but he would solicit it and welcome it up until the point he had made a decision. Then he expected, as appropriate, everybody to, okay, now I've made a decision and I expect you to all execute it faithfully. But up until that point, he wanted to fully explore the risks, the downsides, the alternatives. And I've never seen anybody do it more masterfully. He would not only go around the table, he would literally call on the backbenchers. And woe be to the person like me who scowls when she concentrates, because I would get called out, like, Flournoy, you look like you disagree. Tell me what you're thinking, But just to me, that's an incredibly important practice for a leader, to get the best information to make the best possible decision. The second example I've used is Secretary Gates, who was an incredibly analytic thinker, was very thorough, would read everything, get down into the details of the, intelligence, the plans, the risks, the mitigation. And yet, even as prepared as he was and as thoroughly as he thought through things, he was always willing to listen and reconsider. And the classic example, and he's written about this in his book, so I can tell the story too. With the bin Laden raid, the president had a divided cabinet in terms of what course of action he should pursue. There were some who were against the raid because they didn't find the intelligence to be definitive. There were some who thought that the only way to actually capture him and get all the intelligence on site was to do the raid and put our guys in harm's way. And there were others who thought that was too risky and we should use an experimental drone program just to target him while he's pacing around the compound and so forth. And I think because Secretary Gates had experienced Desert One, he was very leery about losing helicopters and people and so forth. So he was persuaded to initially recommend the drone option. When I and my colleague Mike Vickers heard this, when he coming back from the White House, we were very concerned that he'd made the wrong decision. So we ran up the hallway, and we walked up the hallway quickly to say, can we please see the secretary for 10 minutes? And we went back and he agreed, and we went through all of the risk mitigation measures we had taken to ensure if one of the helicopters went down, we were prepared. If this, if that, we had planned A through Z of risk mitigation, and convinced him that the only way to make sure it was bin Laden to collect this treasure trove of intelligence that we thought was on the compound, which would help us decimate the rest of Al Qaeda, that this was the best option. And it's difficult to call the president back and say, sir, I've changed my mind. But he demonstrated incredible courage to listen, to reconsider, to change his mind, and to call the president and tell him so. So I think that was a tremendous act of leadership, and I learned a lot from that one as well.
And on the bin Laden raid, one of the helicopters did go down. Was that a tense moment for everyone who had helped build to that decision?
Oh, yes. It was, grim faces all around, total silence. But to the credit of the commander, this was like, okay, we've planned for this. We had positioned 2 helicopters behind a land feature to make them unseeable by Pakistani radar. They were literally inside Pakistan behind a land feature, hiding with rotors going. And they got, commander very smoothly said, okay, launch these guys to go in. The SOF team on the ground had a contingency plan to blow up the helicopters because there was a lot of classified instrumentation and materials there. And it all just continued on like clockwork because it had been planned for and even rehearsed. But yes, even so, it was a pretty grim moment. But to the credit of the commanders, they just took it in stride and continued with the mission. One of the most memorable moments of my time in office was, coming out of the White House after midnight. President had made his speech to the nation, and hearing singing. And at first I didn't know what it was. And I realized thousands of people had spontaneously gathered on the lawn outside the gates of the White House, and they were singing the national anthem over and over and over again. And at that point, after being there all day Saturday, all day Sunday, most of the night, just very emotional. I just, burst into tears, but also felt that, this was delivering to the American, not only justice to bin Laden, but to some small amount of closure, for the American people from 9/11. So anyway, that was a very memorable moment, I'm sure, for everybody who had any role whatsoever in that operation.
In addition to the bin Laden raid, can you share other key decision points you faced as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy?
Oh my goodness. It was a busy time. So initially when we came in the Obama administration, obviously we had to do a review of ongoing operations where we had folks in harm's way. So there was an Iraq review that kind of set the strategy going forward, continuing with a phased and conditions-based drawdown that the Bush administration had begun. There's a major Afghanistan strategy review, which eventually decided on the surge and a real focus on counterinsurgency. And there was a very active counterterrorism agenda at the time. Obviously, we were still hunting for bin Laden at that time, but there were also dozens of live threats against the United States and our personnel around the world that we were dealing with. And then, of course, everything else. There was a recognition even at the beginning of the Obama administration of China's growing importance, the need to start to pivot towards Asia strategically. And so it was a very full plate from the beginning.
How did you balance the consideration of a pivot towards the Pacific with the need to continue ongoing operations in the Middle East and the global war on terror?
So obviously, we were fully engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan and counterterror operations. So you couldn't just pick up the marbles and move them all to the Pacific. And we had to think about it responsibly. But what we started to do is to try to put more strategic emphasis on the region. Early on, we tried to make symbols about the rising importance of Asia for us. Secretary Clinton's first visit was to the Asia Pacific. The first state visit that Obama hosted was the Prime Minister of India. We started to show up more in the region, both diplomatically and militarily. At the time, we were engaging very deeply with China, military to military, and I led a number of exchanges with the PLA, trying to have a more open channel of communication with them. So there were lots of things done short of a wholesale shift of our force posture, which was not possible at the time, given the other needs that you mentioned.
What was the tone of those conversations with the PLA, and how do you think that has changed today?
Well, it was an interesting experience. We went in with a lot of candor. We briefed them on our national security strategy, on our defense strategy, on our various policy reviews, seeking to sort of draw from them, their perspective on how they view the world. And more often than not, at the time, we would encounter very set diatribes on topics of choice. So there was the Taiwan diatribe. There was the why do you care about human rights? You shouldn't. These are our internal affairs diatribe. There was, you could go down the list. But what I found was, over time, as you built relationships, you could get off the script and into a more candid exchange. And the further away it was from the direct areas of competition or difference between the US and China, the more they were willing to share. So we did an exchange on lessons learned from humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, where they actually brought a lot of insight to the table. But the closer you got to core issues, the more scripted it was and the more unproductive it was. But at least we were talking then. I mean, what the challenge has been that, the dialogue has been completely suspended until recently. The Chinese typically view the amount of interaction on a rheostat, that they control, and when they're happy with the relationship, they dial it up, and when they're unhappy with the broader relationship, they dial it down. But given that both militaries operate in close proximity, it's really dangerous when you don't have any channels for communication should an accident or some kind of miscalculation occur.
Michèle, could you speak a bit more to some of the diplomacy and strategy that goes into those conversations? How do you balance this American idealism with pragmatic decisions when you're working with a pacing competitor such as China?
I think we approached the conversations in a very realistic way, but in a way that tried to open a genuine dialogue on areas of shared risk. Another example was, the Obama administration sponsored the first attempt to have a serious dialogue with the Chinese about cyber risks. And this was the interagency effort. So it was myself, then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Haas Cartwright, and then Deputy Secretary of State, Jim Steinberg, who tried to engage our counterparts together on a discussion of cyber risks. And, is it possible to set some guardrails so that we don't inadvertently, through various cyber interactions, put ourselves on some path to escalation and conflict? And it was really trying to communicate how we saw different scenarios and risks and the guardrails we think are appropriate. And again, we didn't get a whole lot of substance back from the Chinese at that time. Part of the challenge was the PLA and the senior political leadership were very uncomfortable talking in front of the foreign ministry, which in their system is more of a representational role and not necessarily in a main policy role. And some of the aspects of cyber that were coming up in the conversation are not even things that the foreign ministry would typically be briefed on. So it was I think it was a valiant attempt to try to have a discussion of an area where there are lots of risks and very high stakes, and risks that need to be managed. But it was an opening of a door, but not terribly productive in the first instantiation.
Michèle, you've worked both inside and outside of government on national security. You founded the Center for a New American Security, a think tank focused on strong, pragmatic, and principled national security and defense policies. What led you to create CNAS, and what led to this focus?
I had spent a lot of time, almost a decade, in the think tank world before starting CNAS with Kirk Campbell. And in my experience, a couple of things were true. Number one, it was really focused on policy innovation, which is great, and written products. But the junior staff doing a lot of work that was not acknowledged publicly, so not getting co-authorship on reports, not getting any professional development or training, really was all at the service of the senior people who were in the think tanks. That was thing one. Thing two was I found bipartisanship very brittle. So, for example, at the height of the Iraq War, this is pre-surge, I was at a major think tank, and I felt that, whether you were for the Iraq War or against the Iraq War, the most important question we all had to grapple with is, how do you responsibly bring this conflict to an end in a way that meets U.S. interests or protects U.S. interests? And I was told I couldn't do that study where I was because it would either alienate the Democrats on the board and in the donor base or the Republicans. And it was just too hot to touch, too controversial. And I thought that was crazy. Here we are at a national security think tank. You can't deal with the most consequential issue that is facing the United States at the moment, where we have tens of thousands of people on the line, risking blood and treasure. So the motivations to start CNAS was to create a think tank that was not afraid to, what we call go to the pain, take on the most controversial issues if they are consequential to U.S. national security, and create a safe and civil and respectful space for having that bipartisan debate, or nonpartisan debate, as as could be. Secondly, a think tank that put as much attention on developing the people, the next generation of professionals, as its product. As much attention there as on publishing reports. And so from the beginning, CNAS was designed to really focus on growing talent. We had the Next Gen Fellows Program. We had, serious professional development for our interns and our research assistants and so forth. And it created a different culture and environment that I think has served us well, given you can look at CNAS alumni and you can find them all across the public sector and in service.
CNAS had a really early focus on the nexus of technology and national security. How did you think about this in the early days?
So one of the things we prided ourselves in doing is going to the white space. What's coming over the horizon as a new issue that nobody's focused on, and the importance of tech and the disruptive nature of technology and how it would impact our national security was something we saw looming. And so we started, I think it was the first, think tank program in Washington on tech and national security. And we were fortunate enough to find Paul Charest, who was, Army veteran, but very tech savvy and able to, give real leadership and life to that program early on.
You co-authored the Atlantic Council's Defense Innovation Adoption Report, which found that the United States does not have an innovation problem, but rather an innovation adoption problem. What does this mean?
Well, actually, I will credit Eric Schmidt is the one who I think came up with that phrase. It's not an innovation problem, it's an innovation adoption problem, when he was head of the Defense Innovation Board. But I think translating that, when you look at DoD efforts to incorporate emerging technology and bring it in, into the hands of the warfighter, we've gotten good over time at scouting for the technology and finding interesting examples of things that might be useful. We've gotten reasonably good at prototyping, building one or two of these things, and then experimenting, playing around with them. Where we are still struggling, and where I think the reimagining of the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, could be very helpful, is getting prototypes that the warfighter actually wants into the program of record, into full-scale production and fielding. And that's where we're still struggling. There are some examples you can point to, but they are the exception that prove the rule. And so that's what is meant by innovation adoption. It's really going from discovery and prototyping to actually full-scale development, field production, and fielding, so that the capability is now available to the warfighter. It can, enhance our operational concepts and lead to better outcomes on the battlefield.
Michèle, what you're describing is often referred to as the valley of death between prototyping and actually getting to a program of record. Can you characterize what that valley of death looks like and what needs to be done to overcome it?
Sure. The valley of death is really from the perspective of the early stage tech company, or even a larger tech company, where you've done the prototype and then you're told, well, in 2 years we'll be able to fund production, but there's nothing in between now and then. And so for a young company, there's no revenue for a 2-year period, and that's, if you're lucky, it could be 3 years, could be 4. That's really hard to get your investors to stick with you. In addition to my commercial business, there's this national security business I really want to build, because the return on investment is much slower. So anything that can bridge from prototype into full-scale production is important. And you see the department attempting this with DIU funding that can be that bridge, with various programs that are under the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering that can be part of that bridge.
What are some of the key obstacles in navigating the Valley of Death?
I think a couple of key obstacles. Number one is you have to have a service sponsor that will ultimately make room in their program and budget for a new entrant. And that means in an era of budget constraints, not doing something else or cutting something else. That is a really tough thing, both to get the service to want to do that and to get support for it on the Hill, where existing programs tend to have very entrenched political support. Number two is that the incentive structure for the acquisition and contracting corps is against making those adjustments. They are incentivized to keep existing programs on time, on schedule, on budget. Anything that disrupts that is something that they are not going to like. And furthermore, we have not trained them to work with emerging tech that may require a more agile development process, prototyping, improving as we go on the way to getting into full-scale production. And so we haven't trained people, we haven't incentivized them to take more risk, and we don't necessarily recognize and promote them for doing so. So one of the things I recommend is we need to actually create a subcadre, within the acquisition corps, of people who are really trained and recognized and promoted and incented to work with emerging tech with an agile development process and to move more rapidly to scale production for these systems.
Michèle, you've spoken a lot to the role that DIU plays in accelerating commercial technology across the department. And we've seen DIU be re-elevated to Secretary Austin and its budget expand to nearly $1 billion. Can you speak about what you expect to see with this DIU 3.0 and what you think is kind of most important in DIU's focus right now?
Sure. So first thing is leaders matter. And I think in appointing Doug Beck, someone who both has military experience, forward deployed, but also comes from the tech world and is very mission driven and results oriented. If it can work, he's the right guy to make it work. And I think the fact that Congress, for the first time, has given DIU robust funding to actually bridge programs from prototype to program of record is extremely important. Unfortunately, given the delays in the congressional process of approving the defense budget, he lost 6 months of his 24-month window. So he's got to execute a whole lot of money within an 18-month window. But I think this is really important. And I think what DIU is doing now is really trying to prioritize its investments in the areas that are most critical to solving high priority COCOM and service needs, particularly with regard to the pacing challenge of deterring China in the Asia Pacific. And so I think a good portion of the replicator program that Deputy Secretary Hicks has announced, which is dramatically speeding the fielding of thousands of attritable unmanned systems undersea, on the surface, and in the air. I think replicator will be a major DIU focus, but that's not the sole focus. They are working across the board to go after the most high priority capability gaps for the COCOMs, particularly in the Indo-Pacific.
Michèle, in addition to DIU, what other progress have you seen DoD made in terms of in adoption, be it programs such as AppFit, Radar, or the new Office of Strategic Capital?
I think, again, leaning forward in the right direction. AppFit and Radar are really important programs, are things as well as things like TREX and other authorities under the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering. But again, it's my concern is that these programs are still in pockets of the department, and they're countercultural. They're counter to the normal way of doing business. They are not the mainstream way of doing business. And so I personally think the department's going to have to do more to mainstream this. And, as I said, I think we need a cadre of acquisition and contracting professionals who are specifically trained, rewarded, and promoted to do this kind of work, because the risk posture is almost opposite to what you're trained to do as a DoD 5,000, acquisition professional.
Michèle, do you have any thoughts around how you could actually incentivize acquisition professionals when it's been historically the norm to be risk averse and award contracts to primes as opposed to startups?
Yes, I think the key, there are several key aspects to incentivizing them. One is, first of all, we have to define the problem clearly, moving with greater speed and scale, and working with venture-backed companies or early, emerging tech companies who develop products differently than you would build an aircraft carrier or a fighter jet or a submarine. And educate people on agile development, educate people on, how this works differently. Secondly, in terms of incentives, you've got to reward them. You've got to give them recognition, awards, and ultimately promotions for managing these types of programs with getting things to scale with speed. It's a higher risk tolerance than is traditionally seen in the acquisition corps. And I think if you do that, and young acquisition professionals see their peers or people one generation ahead of them being rewarded and promoted and celebrated for this, you're going to attract a lot of talent into this cadre. But it does, I think, have to be a separate career path, because it's just such a different posture that has to be taken by the individuals involved. If I could just tell one story about incentives, when I was undersecretary, one of the things we did was a human capital strategy. I inherited a workforce that was just exhausted, managing and supporting 2 wars, and just needed to invest in human capital. And so we decided that even as busy as people were, we would get back to mandating a certain amount of professional development and training every year. So we set a standard, and everybody said, yes, ma'am, very good idea. This is wonderful. And then I waited and got no training requests. And I was like, okay, what's going on? And then I started hearing about, oh, well, I can't let my best person go. They're too invaluable. Oh, well, I just haven't had time to fill out the form, all of these excuses. And I finally realized that what I had to do is go into the performance evaluation for supervisors. And with one tweak, we basically said, if you don't get your people, 80% of your people, to 2 weeks of training this year, you can't get a 5, which is the highest score on your performance evaluation. As soon as I announced that, within a few weeks, I had hundreds of training requests, because suddenly every supervisor knew that to get a high rating and preserve my chances for future promotion, I had to take this seriously. So I think small changes in incentives can have huge impacts on the behavior of an organization.
While we're talking about talent, technical talent here in Silicon Valley is always in high demand. How can the DoD and defense technology companies attract the best technical talent against that competition that exists?
I think the number one thing is selling the mission. There is a subset of those people who are looking not just to optimize an advertising algorithm, but to make a difference. And if you said you have a chance to really help our defense and national security enterprise or our intelligence enterprise, there are a lot of folks who would love to have that chance. Second is you got to give them the tools. They can't walk into the DoD or to the IC and feel like I don't have the tools I had on the private sector to actually do what I know how to do. So you have to have the tools, and you have to have an environment that, again, enables and rewards and supports innovation and initiative. So those are all key things. And then there are just the practicalities. When cyber became a big threat area, Congress gave the department all kinds of new authorities to attract cyber talent. We need the same now for digital transformation, for AI, for the broader range of emerging tech, to be able to say, if you commit to serving in DoD for 4 or 5 years, we're going to pay for your education. Or, if you come in, there'll be other opportunities, for you. But we have a soda straw right now of people passing from one world to the other. We have to take that soda straw and make it a superhighway if we're really going to get after this.
Switching gears a bit to talk about emerging tech and tech adoption within the DoD. You wrote a great op-ed about the DoD's need to accelerate AI adoption. How should that play out?
Sure. I think, first of all, we need a framework for doing this responsibly. And hats off to the department. There is a responsible AI framework. They have adopted it. They are figuring out how to operationalize it. And they've also gone out to our allies and partners and gotten dozens of them to sign on to the same framework. So that's thing one. But the other thing is, I think you need to take a crawl, walk, run approach. We need to invest in the foundations. We're not necessarily in a position of having the data the department sits on, which is massive, be ready, though, to be used productively for training models and for powering models. We've got to develop test and evaluation approaches. In hardware, you test something, and then once it's certified, it goes out to the field, and it's kind of not exactly one and done, but it's pretty much done. AI, you can't do that. Testing and evaluation has to be continuous. So anytime the environment changes, the mission is tweaked, the task is tweaked, it has to be an ongoing process. There's a lot of foundational investments that have to be made. But then I do think what we're starting to see is the department is embracing AI in lower risk areas, some enterprise functions, things like getting to more predictive maintenance, using AI to put you in a proactive position to anticipate that a system may fail before it actually fails. Using AI to assist intelligence analysts to separate the wheat from the chaff, to see patterns of behavior that might be tough for a human to figure out, but could be seen by the compute power of a model. So these are all areas where we're starting to walk, and we need to really do that and master those areas before we're ever getting into the debate about, fully autonomous systems and robotic warfare. That's where the debate wants to go right away. But there are 1,000 AI applications that are lower risk and incredibly impactful that the department could take before we ever get to those questions.
Within that crawl, walk, run approach, how can the DoD move fast enough to compete with our adversaries, especially given an AI race with countries like China?
So I think, again, we have to really focus on the problem that we're trying to solve. And the problem, as I see it, is we have to deter China, and specifically President Xi, from deciding to use force to achieve his objectives vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis others like the Philippines and the South China Sea, vis-a-vis Japan and the East China Sea. He has been using gray zone tactics, political coercion, economic coercion. We don't want him to cross the line to actually use outright military force. And so based on that, we have to ask ourselves, what is needed for deterrence? What kind of capabilities do we need to have? And I think the short answer is we need to be able to convince him that he can't succeed. at acceptable risk and cost, that we can deny his success, because I don't think he can afford a failure. That would be a threat to his own legitimacy and staying power in his position. And so generically, given that this is in China's backyard and they will have quantitative advantage, we have to buy back mass, meaning we've got to use unmanned systems to complement our manned systems to be able to mass more forces quickly. We have to adapt our posture, so we're operating from more places inside the region. We have to buy back range, so we can create kinetic effects from longer ranges outside of China's threat rings. And we need incredibly robust and resilient and smart command and control and systems.
Something that we've probably all seen is that a number of experts have assessed that Xi Jinping is preparing the PLA to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. What is your assessment of that time frame and what the U.S. military needs to do to prepare?
Well, I think it is correct that the intelligence community believes that Xi has instructed the PLA to have military options available for him by 2027. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to conduct a blockade or launch an invasion at that time. Our job is to make sure that he decides that they're not ready and it's too risky, even when the options are ready. And so his preferred approach is political pressure, economic coercion, get Taiwan to capitulate without ever having to fire a shot. The fact that the PLA is now regularly rehearsing blockade actions around Taiwan is part of that pressure campaign. The disinformation campaign they launched during the Taiwan elections, which was basically trying to make Taiwan feel isolated and alone, and that you can never count on the United States. If it comes to conflict, it will be over quickly and no one will come to your aid. So you might as well give up now and just accept your fate. I mean, this is constant pressure on the island. So while 2027 is not a date certain by any means, it is an important milestone for DoD and others who have the responsibility to make sure that we are ready to deter Xi by then. Because every day we want him to every day wake up, look at the situation and assess not today. And that's a win. And we need to be ready to do that as a country and with our allies within a few years' time.
Michèle, what does effective deterrence look like? What would be your top priorities to put into place right now to ensure that that calculus remains the same?
I think two things. Number one, or three, resolve is the first thing. She has to believe that the United States of America would show up and actually defend Taiwan if it were attacked unprovoked. The rule of thumb for policy is we would not accept or support any unilateral change of the status quo by either side. And so if China tried to change the status quo by force, unprovoked, the United States should show up and defend Taiwan, in my view. So the first thing is convincing him that that is in fact the case, and an American president would make that decision. Number two is to convince him that we would not be alone, that our allies, Japan, Australia, Philippines, other partners in the region and beyond, would condemn Chinese action, would support our military action, would impose economic sanctions, that there would be a global campaign to impose costs on China for this action. And then most importantly, third, we have to demonstrate to him that we have the capabilities to prevent his military success, to actually deny his success. And that means he needs to see us demonstrating, fielding systems that would dramatically complicate his ability to send forces across the strait, which is no small feat, sustain those forces and actually conduct coherent military operations that, when they're highly contested by Taiwan, by us, and by others. So I think those are the key elements as I see them.
Michelle, in that third bucket you outlined, what are some of the most pressing and acute defense tech capabilities that you think the U.S. needs to maintain a technological and operational edge over China?
Well, so first thing, he has to know that we can continue to command and control our forces to target and deliver effects, even in a very contested environment, electronic warfare environment, GPS denied, et cetera. And so when he should see, when we're investing in things like quantum sensing, compute at the edge, mesh computing. These are ways in which you can continue to have coherent military operations absent GPS, in a denied environment. I think this is one of the primary lessons that we've seen from the Russia-Ukraine war, is that any future conflict with a peer competitor or near peer competitor like China or Russia is going to be very heavy on electronic warfare, and we've got to make sure that we can continue to operate coherently in a very contested environment. So that, I think, that is thing one. And then thing two is he has to know that he's not going to be able to waltz across the strait unmolested, that there will be systems in place to target his naval forces. And we want to make sure that there's a question in his mind whether he can actually get the forces across the strait to conduct their mission. And then I would also say, if he chooses not invasion, which is the more extreme, but I think less likely scenario, and goes into a blockade, he has to believe that we also are developing concepts and capabilities to be able to break that blockade.
Michelle, you mentioned a few minutes ago what we're seeing in Ukraine. How has the battlefield in Ukraine changed the way the DoD thinks about fielding defense technology?
I think this is an unanswered question. There's lots of lessons learned studies underway to look at what's happened in Ukraine. But I think some of the early conclusions might be, number one, it was really powerful to declassify some intelligence and let the world know what Putin was about to do in terms of a cohesive allied response from NATO. Two, commercial technology for the Ukrainians so that they could command and control their forces was critical, and figuring out ways to rapidly deploy that and train them on it and get it in use, that was key. Third, unmanned systems have played an outsized role. I would also say the Ukrainians have done remarkably well with what they've had in terms of air and missile defense, and not allowing Russia to have uncontested airspace, even though they have, their air force is, far greater than anything Ukraine can field. And I also think they've done very well with deception and decoys, getting the Russians to strike a lot of stuff that's not real and waste ammunition that way. So it's not over, but I think there's a lot of learning that we should do and should, be ported over into how we're conceptualizing either deterring Putin against further aggression, or Xi in the case of aggression in the Indo-Pacific.
Michelle, in some ways, the U.S. has struggled to compete in the field of small unmanned systems made by our adversaries in terms of both cost and efficacy. We saw a Wall Street Journal article in April highlighting the failure of some American drones to turn the tide in Ukraine. What are the lessons we're learning here about keeping up with our adversaries on small attritable systems?
Yeah, this has not been a major area of focus previously. We tended to focus on very high-end, large, exquisite drones, the kinds of the predators that were used in the war on terror and so forth. So we haven't put a lot of emphasis on cheap, attritable systems that swarm to create effects. But that is very much the focus of the replicator program, and I think that program is starting to produce some interesting results. Most of them appropriately are highly classified, but they are responding directly to the highest priority COCOM needs, and in terms of what is needed to deter and deny in the Indo-Pacific.
And for our audience who is unfamiliar with Replicator, can you talk about what that program is and what it's doing?
So this was a program that was announced by the Deputy Secretary, and it's basically says, the goal is to field several thousand cheap, attritable drones in multiple domains, undersea, on the sea, and in the air, to serve a variety of functions, from intelligence and surveillance reconnaissance to kinetic destruction to counter mine to ASW, anti-submarine warfare, to electronic war. I mean, they're mission agnostic. There are lots of different flavors of what these things could look like. But to basically buy back mass and greatly complicate Chinese operational planning by mixing these unmanned swarms into the battlefield. It presents a lot of new challenges for the PLA in terms of both defense and their own targeting and offense. So that's the idea. It's not going to be the silver bullet. It is one initiative, but it is the first initiative that's really pushing the department to take these opportunities seriously and to move much more quickly towards fielding systems.
Michèle, it's really evident in the way you speak about your career, what a deep commitment you have to defense, tech, and national security across your background. Where does your kind of personal commitment to service come from, and what has really driven this work that you've done?
So, I had a father and two uncles who served in World War II, part of the greatest generation. They never talked about it, but it was an example. There were some heroic things that went on. And as I came to understand that, I really appreciated their willingness to serve. And I think, my parents instilled in me this sense of not directing me to public service per se, but like, you get one life and make it matter. Why are you here on this earth? And what is your purpose? How are you going to leave the place better than when you found it? And that's your job, is to figure that out. What is that? What is that calling? What is that path? And then later, that was reinforced by, marrying someone who had served his country for 26 years, and well, at the time, not 26, but eventually 26. And then also, inspiring some of our children to serve. And so it became it's just a very reinforcing sense of a family obligation and a family sense of purpose, that, we're all going to find some way to serve. It doesn't have to be the military, it doesn't have to be national security, but that ethos has just gotten stronger and stronger in our family over time.
And Michèle, for all the engineers and potential startup founders who are listening, why should they consider building for national security?
Your country needs you. There's never been a more daunting time for us, maybe during the Civil War. But I mean, when you look at the challenges we face with this very aggressive, revisionist Russian leader, with a rising China that is bent on changing the status quo by force if necessary, with threats from climate change to cyber attacks to proliferation, the list goes, pandemic. We need the best and brightest from across this country to give whatever they can to protect and defend our Constitution, our way of life. And right now, given the period of disruption, technological disruption that we're in, we need the tech sector. We can't do it without the best and brightest minds in tech helping. So finding that mission that matters, that speaks to you, and figuring out a way to contribute, whether it is contributing from your company and serving the federal government or the allies, whether it's coming in for a stint in government and trying to help government do better on tech adoption, whatever flavor that takes, find a way to make a difference to your country's national security. It is the reason why you have the freedoms that you have. It is the reason why the United States has the tech ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem that is the envy of the world. This system has not been recreated fully anywhere else. And that's part of what we need to defend.
And Michèle, I think that's an incredible place for us to wrap up. This was such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, Michèle.
Thanks again for joining us on the Defense Tech Underground. The Defense Tech Underground is dedicated to highlighting the intersection of technology and national security. We bring you conversations with leaders in defense tech and national security innovation.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a rating wherever you listen to your podcast. It helps new listeners find us. And one last note. What you heard on the podcast today reflects the views of the participants and does not represent those of the Defense Tech Underground, the Gordian Knot Center, or Stanford University.
Please be sure to subscribe to the Defense Tech Underground so that you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.